So it's my privilege today to introduce Carrie Brubaker, PhD. Carrie has an MS and PhD in biomedical engineering from Northwestern. She's had roles in science policy, education. She did postdoc work with cancer bioengineering. She's also had roles in product development, project management, and then she moved to Gilead Sciences as a senior manager of medical affairs for oncology and cell therapy. And now she works freelance, doing scientific engagement and medical comms. So Carrie, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to talk about the alphabet soup of my professional path, if that's helpful for anyone, to be sure.
It's really fantastic, and especially for me as a humanities grad, I'm when talking to medically oriented people, it's always a very different path, but ironically, a lot of the same struggles.
To be sure.
Just very different vocabulary maybe that accompanies the skills sometimes. So I want to talk about your journey. Could we start maybe just with you in academia? Like where were you? What were you working on? What was that background like?
Certainly. So I think I might actually take it even a step further back, because there's a step even prior to my graduate work that has, I realized, informed some of the things that have come after. So when I was coming to the end of my undergraduate degree, I received a bachelor's of biochemistry and a bachelor's of French from UCLA. I was coming to the end of my undergrad, and I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school because at the time, I really loved the science. I really loved the lab. I was particularly drawn to polymer chemistry and biomaterials, but I knew that I didn't want to go directly to graduate school. And in my final year at university, I was kind of racking my brain, what am I going to do? I can't really join the Peace Corps. How can I make this work? And through the French department, I ended up finding a role where the French Ministry of Education takes on English as a second language instructors or other languages as well, Spanish, Italian, and so forth. They take in instructors who are not necessarily professional teachers for a year-long program to work in their underserved school districts. And this is in let's say, more suburban or rural parts of France, but also in the dom-tom, the Département et Territoire Outre-mer. So former colonial locations, for example, that are departments and territories still of France. Guadeloupe, for example.
Yeah.
And I ended up applying and getting selected for that program. So immediately the year following my undergraduate, I picked up and I moved to France, which was an amazing opportunity for a person in their, early 20s to be able to do. I had a wonderful time teaching elementary school kids English. I designed all the programs, but really it was the opportunity for me to perfect my French, because I was the only fluent Anglophone for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers around.
Yeah.
Although they asked me to stay on, I had at that point applied and had been accepted and was deciding on graduate programs. So it was a wonderful year in France. And then I subsequently returned to the United States to undertake my joint master's and PhD in biomedical engineering at Northwestern in Evanston and in Chicago, Illinois. That whole program took about 6 years because it is a joint program. Had an excellent experience, really enjoyed my research, and enjoyed it so much that I knew that I wanted to continue. I did have a plan to become a faculty member. That's what I wanted to do. There was the science component, there was the mentoring component, there was the teaching component, and I enjoyed all of those things. So the recruitment process, let's say, or the application process for postdoctoral research in the biomedical sciences is often not straightforward. Has a lot to do about relationships with the senior faculty who have supervised you or who have been on your committee or whom you've met at conference and so forth. So in that regard, I like to think that I was relatively successful. I went to work at the EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland, in the area of nanobiomaterials for bioengineering, immunoengineering, and particularly in the cancer and vaccine space, as you alluded to. So my postdoctoral training went on for about 4 years. And I think even then, maybe a part of my brain knew that something different was going to happen, because there were times when, should I have been designing research projects and should I have been updating my lab notebook? Yes, I should have. Did I do that a lot? Yes, I did. But what I also did was pursue additional training opportunities. For example, more of these kind of learning and development type activities, negotiation tactics, let's say. Another good example of a series of trainings that I undertook was in the design of adult learning. And this makes sense if you want to become a professor, but there was also a part of it that had more to do with, how do we actually engage people? How do we help people learn? And that's a really important skill, completely independent of, let's say, an academic learning environment. It's an important life skill, I think. And then ultimately, by the end of my postdoctoral program, for a variety of reasons, it became clear that the path that I had been working on, which was to become a faculty at an R1 institution, that just wasn't the direction that things were going to go. And so I found myself in a situation that perhaps a lot of us have found ourselves in, which is, okay, what now? So that brings me
Absolutely.
to the end of the academic component.
Yeah, I want to just ask for a minute about those extra courses you took on the side, or the extra kind of professional development. And that's something, it's really important. And I think it was something I didn't do as well as I could have. I did do some of it though. But it's really interesting. Like, what, I think you kind of alluded to it, but what you found, did you find that those started to develop your ability to think more about opportunities outside of academia? Did they start to shift your mind a little bit and kind of expand your horizons as to what you might do with this? Or like, what kind of effect did that kind of side training have on you?
Yeah, when I look back on it, it feels, and I still don't know the answer, was it a chicken or was it an egg? Was the interest always there and going after it helped develop it? Or was it just this kind of completely random event that fell from the sky? Let's say that the outcome was a bit of a snowball effect, which was, I participated in the negotiations training. I participated in the design of adult learning training program. I completed a project management certification. And each step, as you rightfully point out, opened a little window, opened a little door, prompted some additional thinking about, oh, okay, I really like this part of it. I know that I don't like that part of it. And completely independent of the work that I loved and the science that I loved and the projects that were amazing, I'm really grateful that I gave myself the opportunity to do a little bit something different, to dedicate that sort of 10%, that 15% to something else besides my existence in a laboratory.
No, that's really fascinating. So you start to get kind of a sense of what you might do outside of academia. When the time came when you decided that it was time to go, did that kind of happen all at once, or was it something you kind of like, did you have one day where you're just like, that's it, this has to happen? Or was it kind of a gradual realization, or?
I suppose it's terribly complicated to say it was a little bit of both, because there were a couple of factors that were involved that were both external and internal. I would say realistically, if I want to encompass the whole experience, it probably took place over about 6 months, I would say.
That's cool.
Which with a lot of kind of, Sunday night scaries kind of thinking, which I think we've all been there, that sort of existential crisis moment that you either push aside, push it down, don't think about it, or no, this is actually standing for something and I need to respect it for what it is.
Yeah. And in terms of starting to move forward, what were kind of the first steps you took to start to make that transition? Where did you start? Aside from, I guess, really you could say those courses you were taking were maybe unbeknownst to you already beginning that transition. But once it was time to leave, where did you go from there?
Sure thing. And this is, of course, one of the key questions, right?
Yeah.
As you alluded to, I certainly called upon those initial experiences and even used the opportunity to, let's say, reconnect with people that I did the programs with. Other participants, or even also connected with the moderators of those programs that I felt some kind of rapport or connection with, or had stayed in touch, to start to talk it through with people. And, another layer of challenge is that when I was going through this process, I was living in another country.
Yeah.
I was on a visa, living in another country, not a citizen of the country in which I was where I was an inhabitant. And so there was an additional layer of complication of, well, I need to find employment so that I can stay here if indeed this is where I want to be for now. So that was another part of the decision process is, well, okay, I'm changing tack, but I also need to think about where I want to do that. And so at that time, I looked at the ensemble of my personal and professional life and realized that I wanted to make a go of it in Switzerland. And that very simply involved a topic, Chris, that you and I have addressed somewhat significantly recently, which is networking.
Yeah.
I had to pick myself up, put the big girl pants on, and start reaching out to people. Yeah. Start reaching out to people who had recently gotten jobs, who I knew from my academic environment, whether that was in industry or in a hospital setting or project management, even consulting, and really wrote a lot of emails and made a lot of phone calls and tried to meet people for coffee. This was, of course, when we could work face to face.
Could do that, yeah.
And ultimately, it was thanks to that combination of proactive reach out and network engagement that I got my two subsequent sort of most significant activities while I was living in Switzerland.
And I take it, so just for background, because I know a lot of people fear networking, and it's something we talk about all the time. Mm-hmm. Obviously, as you've already alluded to, it was difficult, right? Like it wasn't just super easy to kind of connect with people, or it takes a lot to swallow pride or nerves or whatever it is and do those reach outs, right?
Yeah, it definitely does. I feel very much about networking like I do about interviewing. They're two different experiences, but there is a lot of psychological overlap there. Yeah. This feeling like you're have to put on a show, and that's really, I don't think that's the right way to look at it. Do you have to be your most authentic and professional self? Absolutely. Yeah. But no one's going to come in with a hook off the side of the stage if you mess up a little bit, if you mispronounce something, if you stumble. I think that people are nervous to make a mistake in those settings, or to stumble. somehow.
Yeah.
And if there's a way that can be overcome, honestly, I think it's just with practice.
Yeah.
I was total crap at networking when I first started, just like I was total crap at interviewing when I first started.
Yeah.
And I did not get it right the first 5 or 10 times even. But it is so completely worth it in the end to keep practicing and keep putting yourself out there. And we can certainly talk about techniques or so on, but I'm with you, Chris. I can't speak highly enough about the value of networking and just giving it a go.
It's funny because we had a conversation not too long ago when you and I met digitally for the first time, and that's networking in a sense, right? Now both you and I have been doing this for long enough that I don't think either of us were especially nervous or especially palms weren't sweating or anything. It's just it's just a conversation, right? Like, what do you do? What are you working on? Like, trying to connect with people. But I agree. I think those first few times are the hardest, and it's a bit like pulling a Band-Aid off. That it's just something that, and the same goes with sending a message to somebody. That you don't always get a response necessarily, and it's really hard to put yourself out there. But I totally agree. I mean, it's so fundamental to career transitions. So, so that first role, what can you tell us a little bit about the first role, kind of out of academia, what you were doing? And
sure, yeah. So I went through a period of which was also instrumental. I went through a period of kind of freelancing and contract positions, which is, I now of course realize, extremely coincidental that I've returned to freelancing, but we can get to that later. And it had completely to do with the fact that I cold emailed the managing directors of this organization. So I was interested already in the concept of scientific and medical communications. And I was trying to, because academic publications and grant writing and even patents, like, I've done all of that. You know what I mean? Like, how hard can it be? Turns out it's actually quite a bit more complicated than that. I didn't know it at the time. I do now. But I thought, you know what? This is something that I'm good at. It's something that I enjoy. The communications component of it. Publications, getting the word out, communicating data effectively. That sounds like something that's meaningful to me. So I reached out here and I reached out there, and I cold emailed, as I said, the managing directors of a medical communications and medical education agency located outside of Basel, Switzerland. And they asked me to do some short-term work with them, basically as sort of like a junior project manager that was in support of some programming and some congresses that they were helping their big pharma clients to support. And that was very big of them, of course. They didn't need to do that, but it worked out quite well. And, gave me the opportunity to experience a completely different environment and also have a first exposure to how pharmaceutical organizations run their show. So almost directly out of my postdoc, I was already getting that kind of exposure.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And I take it, as it sounds like it was a completely different world. It wasn't just more of the same. Is that a fair assumption? Like it was completely different. Yeah, it was completely different. I remember my very last day in the lab. I knew at that point that, it was done. And I remember my last day in the lab being so bittersweet in a way, because I had done it for so many years, I started working in labs back when I was in high school. Like, it had been a long time. And then on that day, I just sat in the hood and I was cleaning up my samples, and I thought, you know what? I am never going to do this again. Wow.
That felt super weird at the time, but there was also this sort of dawning realization of, well, if I've enjoyed this for so long and I'm good at it, there are going to be other things that I'm going to enjoy, and I need to go and find out what those things are.
That's such a great attitude.
It was terrifying.
Yeah.
But you if you can give yourself the freedom and the permission to go forward in that way, it makes such a huge difference. And so your question about it was a completely different environment absolutely resonates for me, because the answer is a resounding yes.
Yeah.
I wasn't doing the science anymore, but I was seeing the outcomes of science.
Yeah.
And I was seeing how the outcomes of science can make a difference in patients' lives.
That's really cool.
And that's something that's motivated me continually going forward.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, let's talk about, I mean, we don't have to talk about all of your roles because you've had a lot, but I know the people watching will be really, really interested to hear a little bit more about a couple of things in particular. So why don't we talk a little bit about, can we talk a little bit more about that big pharma thing? Like what's the, I don't know, what surprised you about moving into that pharma environment? What did you find really, kind of what skills did you already have that made it work for you? What did you have to learn really fast? Like what, could we dive into that just a little bit more? I'm interested to hear.
Sure thing. So there was an intermediate, couple of things that I did that led to the role, the permanent position that I had in medical affairs previously. And what I was really happy about to be able to take into that role is that even though I was new to pharma, which can be a bit of a challenge, they sometimes struggle bringing people in kind of mid-career. But if you can present why you have the sort of multidisciplinary background that's going to be valid to the team, there's always ways in. And I had the feedback from my former boss and the woman who was the hiring manager. She said, I didn't mind that you don't have your entire career in medical affairs. What I was looking for was the scientific mindset that you have, a project and program management mindset that you have, and your ability to engage. So that's what I brought walking in the door, thanks to the 1,000 of little things that I had kind of dabbled in or worked on or developed previously.
Yeah.
And was it an absolute chaos, unbelievable confusion for 3 months? Yes, it was. But that's the experience that anybody has, right? The first 3 months in any new big role are just because you're learning all the processes and you're meeting people and you're reading between the lines and you're getting your emails and your schedule figured out and so on and so forth. So what I think what I really want to say is that the ensemble of experiences and capabilities that I had developed got me in the door.
Right.
And then helped me be as effective as I could possibly be during that first 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
Which is when you learn how the company does its business.
Right.
And one pharma company to the next is going to be different. One economic area is going to be different from the next. I remember I talked to a guy who had come into my previous company, and he used to be at Visa. He was in information technology at Visa. And we spent an hour talking about the contrasts between, the finance sector and the pharmaceutical sector. And so I'm going to close that set of comments by highlighting the fact that it's really important for people who are in job transition to do their research. Because, as a Let me use an example. As a person with economics training, one could conceivably be interested in the finance team at Visa or the finance team at Big Pharma or the finance team at a hospital or the finance team at Mercedes-Benz. But those environments are going to be completely different from each other. And that brings us back to networking. Yeah. It's always best to talk to the people that are in those environments so that you can apply and go in with your eyes wide open.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the role of medical affairs, because I know it's a role that people might be interested in. Sure. Could you talk a little bit more about like what the role kind of entails and the type of work you did, kind of the day-to-day?
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I would make the initial point that medical affairs can be thought of as an in-house role and a field role, because the role of the field team in medical affairs, this is a position that's known as a medical liaison or a medical scientific liaison or an MSL. They are basically the face of the organization when it comes to engaging doctors in a non-sales discussion. And engaging doctors and nurses and sometimes patients and sometimes payer systems. There are a lot of different levels where liaisons engage, depending on their job and on their job title. But these are all discussions that are non-promotional and require the liaison to have a very comprehensive understanding of the science and the clinical data behind the product that they're working with. So you need to be able to talk about clinical trial design, clinical trial outcome. You have to have an awareness of the competitor space, and you have to be confident engaging with healthcare professionals, whether it's a one-on-one meeting in their office or at a big conference with 35,000 other people. Yep. There's a lot of environments where those types of engagements take place. Now, in an in-house role, there's a bit less of that healthcare professional direct engagement, but it does still take place because we're involved in a whole slew of other activities that have more to do with tactical and strategic planning. So this has everything to do with the how and the why we're engaging. This means designing conference activity. This means being involved in phase 4 clinical research, so doing post-approval research program management. This also has to do with medical communications. We're involved in journal publications with the key opinion leaders who have familiarity with the product. When I was in medical affairs, I worked very closely with commercial teams, regulatory affairs, clinical research, legal business conduct. So it's an extremely cross-functional role that, again, like I've already mentioned a little bit in the discussion so far, requires direct engagement and working with a lot of different types of people, a lot of different training backgrounds, knowing how to navigate those conversations, knowing how to navigate those meetings to get the outcome that's best for the organization and of course best for doctors and patients.
That's really neat. And I can kind of hear already kind of a stream of or a thread between the discussion we had earlier about those capacities you were developing while doing your postdoc again, and the type of work you ended up doing, because you ended up doing a lot of the same things. Ironically, even I have on my resume in a totally different world, the project management, the stakeholder relations, all that right. Sort of all those skills that are sort of universal, but just in a very different environment. But right. It sounds like you had like you'd been developing those all along, and it's quite the interesting skill set. I mean, as somebody on the outside looking in, it's impressive enough to have the scientific background, but to have the scientific background and also be able to leverage like the project management skills, which don't necessarily come naturally to everybody, or the stakeholder relations skills, which don't come naturally to everybody. That's really fantastic. So it sounds like a really interesting and kind of, I'm sure I'm sure, as you've alluded to, there's probably a lot of variety in medical affairs, but it sounds like a very interesting job. It just sounds like there's a lot of different facets that make it probably the day to day is probably never the same. I'm guessing. Is that your kind of assessment, or?
Yeah, never. Not
That's
at
really
all.
neat.
Yes, it's extremely dynamic because you have to respond to market need, to be perfectly frank. But you also have to respond to patient need, and you have to respond to when your competitors publish great data or even terrible data. You have to, there's always a day-to-day integration of 1,000 different signals. And it is certainly a job that cannot be done in a vacuum. Nobody in medical affairs works alone in their own little box. You're constantly engaging all of your colleagues to drive things forward.
That's really cool. So I want to get to where you're at right now, but before we do that, what advice would you have for somebody trying to get into medical affairs?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the response does indeed have to do with whether you're interested in pursuing an in-house or a field-based role. I will say that particularly for field-based roles, the expectation is that you do have an advanced degree, usually either a medical degree, a PharmD, so a Doctor of Pharmacy degree, or a PhD in a biomedical science-related setting. In-house roles are a little bit more of a variety at any major pharma, biopharma, biotech that you would think about. It turns out that the medical affairs team is even larger and even more complex than I've mentioned. There are roles for everything to do from event management to the library and information services team to medical information. And so my initial recommendation would definitely be, again, to do the research. I think for any job that someone is interested in, actually reading the job descriptions on company websites is a really, really valuable way to understand the types of backgrounds that these roles are looking for, and to give you a flavor of where you should be aiming. Because pharma tends to use a little bit of its own lingo. And so it's going to be important to understand the difference between an associate specialist and a director. And how much experience should an executive director have? A lot. But who an associate specialist is actually going to potentially vary. So, read those job descriptions, read between the lines. You can also search on LinkedIn, of course, within companies. You can search for job titles or search for individuals based on their functional area, and also get a feel from their background, the type of work that they've done or the experiences that have led them to be where they are. I'm trying to think if there's any other advice that I can specifically offer. One thing that I do want to put out there for perhaps younger listeners is that large pharma organizations have internship programs. And these can vary widely. Sometimes they can even be for college students. They can also be for students in graduate programs. So definitely another angle to explore. And it's not necessarily even exclusively in medical affairs. This provides interns an opportunity to be exposed to the pharma setting more broadly. Usually requires, a type of project and then a major presentation at the end and answering questions and doing reports and so on. But I've engaged with interns and summer program students in the past, and it can be a really wonderful opportunity and first exposure for them.
In terms of those kind of professional development courses that we were talking about, is there anything that you would recommend? I mean, even for people while they're studying, is there something, some capacity that they should have that they might consider working at on the side while they're doing a degree?
So nothing that is officially structured, but my recommendation for people who are involved in, let's say, the biomedical sciences, especially PharmDs and PhDs, if you know that you're interested in pursuing or thinking about medical affairs, you have to be very good at talking to doctors. So especially if you're not doing that in a sort of controlled, program-oriented way, you have to find a way to do it. Because one of the things that I learned early on is that healthcare professional fields and the people that inhabit them engage in very different ways. So the way that I converse, for example, or engage with a transplant surgeon is very different than a dermatologist.
Wow. That's really interesting.
So it's important to have that practice and that sort of ease of adaptation, and meeting your discussant, meeting your conversation partner on their level.
Wow, that's really neat. There's so much more there, but I don't want to go too much further down this path just for the sake of time. But I have other questions that come to mind. But I want to move on to where you're at now, because I know it's really going to be of interest to our readers too. So you did the jump, as I did too, into consulting, and it's endlessly interesting place to be. And consulting is a really big catch-all term that covers a lot of things. You and I are both in very different worlds, but we're both consultants in a way. So what would you, sorry, first of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, the type of work that you're doing. And maybe even what you love about it, if you're
Sure. So again, the theme kind of continues, is taking the ensemble of what you've already done and kind of pushing the ball further down the road. One of the things that was so valuable about my period working in that sort of structured medical affairs, big pharma company environment, is that I was able to identify that there were parts of my job that I really, really loved. And there were parts of my job that I didn't. And I think that's true for all of us, no matter where we're at. There are just bits that you say, I could just never do this again, and that would be fine. And in a way, it's quite scary at times to make the transition to being, in a freelance setting or in a consultant setting. But it has allowed me to pursue exactly what I enjoy about all of that stuff that came before. So what I'm doing now in a let's call it a freelance project manager and consultant setting is that I'm helping individuals, teams, companies, collaborations be the most effective at engagement as they possibly can be. And this comes primarily through medical education. So that is, how do we provide secondary continuing education to people who are already healthcare professionals? There are any number of companies globally that do this. They deliver meetings, they deliver online content, they deliver trainings, they deliver roundtables, they deliver webinars. Some of them also consult to major pharma organizations to help pharma organizations do a better job of this. Another angle that I'm also involved in is understanding how people engage with their target audience in general. So this can be particularly meaningful, for example, for a tech or a biotech or a med tech startup company. They might only be 4 or 6 or 12 people. And as you know, in the startup setting, it's everything all at once and everything is on fire. And you're just, you're bringing in your money and you're trying to grow your audience and so on and so forth. And maybe you just need 3 months help on that particular thing to help your company move forward. And that's where I come in, because I have that project management experience. I have the budgeting experience. I have vendor engagement experience. I know how to talk to doctors. I know how to talk to collaborators. I have the technical background. So in particular, if I'm looking at an issue in the biomedical sciences, I can access it relatively easily. I don't have to know everything about their platform or their molecule or so on. Yeah. But I have a training that allows me to access it relatively quickly. And that's how I now try to bring value to my clients and to the teams that I'm working with, is supporting their processes using my expertise.
That's really cool. And I think I think I kind of heard you reflect in there about what you love about it all the way through. That is that the kind of ability to in a sense just dig down on what you're good at too, I think, and the things you really love doing, and just kind of leverage that and leave some of the, I mean, there's obviously in every role, I'm sure there's not everything you love, but a lot of it you really can. So that's really neat. I'm curious, I think like science comms is such an interesting place for a lot of scientists, because I know that, I mean, the science comms is a big world, but science comms education, all these types of things, because I know a lot of people are frustrated with the fact that information doesn't always go to where it's supposed to be be, right? That there's kind of sometimes a lapse, whether it's from the academy out, or perhaps in this case from organizations out. So I know there's a lot of people interested in these types of roles. So I'd come back to that question again, like what advice would you have for people, not necessarily just in consulting, because I know that companies do hire for these types of roles as well. What kind of advice would you have for somebody thinking more about this, about like either the education or the communications kind of spectrum of things? And then I may ask you more about consulting in a second, but maybe the other first, if that's okay.
Sure. No, I think a really valuable place to start, where there's already a lot of content and sort of information available, is in the area of medical writing. And medical writing is another one of these roles that is unfortunately a bit of a, I want to apologize to your watchers. I have a fly flying around in here, so sorry everyone. Medical writing is another one of these terms that's so broad, and there's so much to medical writing that the term medical writing just kind of becomes a little bit diluted somehow. There are medical writing agencies. Medical writing is inherent to larger pharma and biotech organizations. And there's a lot of information out there, for example, on the internet about what it means to do medical writing, and all of the different types of activities that you can be involved in. And so I think generally exploring that can be very informative, and help get a feel for the really significant variety of work that can be done under that umbrella, in particular in the domain of getting the right information out to people, for sure.
That's really cool. And one last thought from you, maybe on consulting advice you would have for people thinking about doing consulting, and then we'll maybe wrap up and move to some questions. But what would you say to somebody thinking about doing consulting?
Yeah, we always have to be careful about our language, because there are two ways that I think about consulting. There's the big consulting companies. So if someone says, I'm like a consultant,
McKinsey or something,
then that means that they work for McKinsey or BCG or so forth. But then there's also the type of independent consulting that you and I are doing. And I can speak to the BCGs and the McKinseys, because many people that I love and care about do those roles and very well. But in terms of the more independent setting that I think that you're referring to, again, honestly, it all goes back to networking capability and overcoming any instinct that you or I or the listeners may have that just you get in your own way, right? There are 10 ways that you can say to yourself, oh, no, not today. I'm not going to reach out to that person. Oh, it's too late in the day, whatever. No. And is there a little bit of sales in it? Absolutely. Is there a little bit of business development in it? Absolutely. But the key aspect of all of it is communicating your own value, and communicating your ability to support that team with what they need. That's really the crux of it, in my opinion. And in the end, that's no different than any other job, is it really? is when we go to interview, we're communicating our expertise and we're communicating the value that we can bring to that team and to that organization. People who are independent consultants may need to have those conversations more often or with a greater variety of people than if you're just interviewing for a single permanent role. But either path you take, the skill set actually is very similar.
That's really cool.
In my opinion.
Yeah. And the one thing I always say about the type of consulting, and you're quite right to make the distinction. This is more like a freelance consulting. Is one of the things that I realize in retrospect is that I could have never been successful at it had I not worked a job first. A lot of people kind of want to jump out of a PhD into consulting, and there may be scenarios you can do that.
Yes. No, I will cut you off to agree with you that having been employed and having somewhat of a variety of experiences is what contributes to your bona fides.
Yeah.
So from where I sit and from my background, I would not advise that people attempt to go directly into freelance consulting, let's say in the broad arena of biomedical sciences, because there is an aspect of needing to demonstrate your bona fides.
Yeah.
That eventually your clients are going to want and need to see.
Yeah. No, I want to thank you so much. This was a really, really interesting conversation, and I've learned so much from you as well. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom from a whole spectrum of different experiences. And I know that this is going to be helpful for those who are trying to figure out their path forward. Lots of great advice for several different industries and paths. So, Carrie, thanks again for joining me, and we'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Chris, thank you so much to those of you joining now and those of you listening to this. All the best. Thank you for this opportunity. And we'll talk again soon.